The beach was quiet that morning, the air still heavy with the scent of last night's rain. A pale sky stretched above the Pacific, the horizon blurred where the water met the dawn. The only sound was the low, rhythmic breathing of the waves, pulling at the shore like a lullaby that never quite soothed. It was the 13th of January, 1985, and in the tourist town of Manzanillo, the sea had a habit of giving back what it took. Just after sunrise, a local man walking the sand stopped abruptly. There, half turned toward the sky, lay a woman. Her body rested where the tide reached lazily, each wave pushing a fringe of foam across her bare feet before retreating again. Her hair, long, blonde, tangled with strands of seaweed spread around her head like the halo of a drowned goddess. She wore a light summer dress, now heavy with water, clinging to her like a shroud. The fisherman recognized her, though not from the small town streets. He'd seen her face before, beaming from the glow of a hotel television in a crowded cantina. A woman from American late-night shows, always smiling, always draped in sequins, the very image of effortless charm. But here, under the pale Mexican sun, the smile was gone. The police arrived with the slow, careful movements of men already anticipating paperwork. They noted the lack of obvious injuries, the absence of shoes, the strange fact that her handbag and passport had not been lost to the water, but were instead tucked away safely in her hotel room. She was identified as Carol Wayne, 42 years old, an actress most remembered for her recurring role as the flirtatious matinee lady on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. On the beach, the tide continued its small, repetitive gestures, as if trying to smooth away the details. But the details were stubborn. Carol had checked into a luxury hotel with a man days before. She had been seen at dinner, laughing, or at least smiling, only hours before she vanished. And now, here she was, lying in the shallows, her skin cool beneath the rising sun. Death at sea is often written quickly as misadventure. The authorities murmured the word accidental, as if it could soothe the unease already gathering in the air. But something in the scene resisted that tidy conclusion. The delicate angle of her head on the sand, the way her hands were turned palm, up toward the sky, and the odd feeling that she had been set here, not swept here. In the weeks to come, her friends would speak of the contradictions, how Carol feared deep water, how she swam only close to shore, how she was not the kind to wander alone into the night. Those who had seen her last insisted she had been in good spirits, yet others whispered of debts, fading roles, and the slow tightening of life's grip. For now, though, the beach belonged to the moment. The pale light, the warm breeze lifting a lock of her hair, the endless arrival and retreat of the waves. In that fragile space between night and day, the body of Carol Wayne became another question left on the sand, and the ocean, calm, indifferent, offered no answer. Somewhere, a hotel clock ticked toward the hour, unaware that one of its guests would never return. Before she was the still form on a foreign shore, Carol Wayne was a living vision of television's golden light. In the hazy glow of the late 1972nd, she would glide into the set of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, her sequined gowns catching and scattering the stage lights into 1,000 glittering shards. The audience always laughed before she spoke. She carried with her the comic inevitability of a punchline, the assurance that for the next few minutes, something charmingly absurd would happen. Her recurring role as the matinee lady in Carson's tea time movie skits made her a fixture of American late night. She played the foil perfectly wide-eyed, sweetly naive, with just enough hesitation in her voice to suggest a hidden awareness of the double entendres flying around her. Johnny Carson, master of the sly glance, would lead her through the sketch, and she would deliver the line that tipped the entire exchange into knowing laughter. Television made her into a sort of public fantasy. The beautiful woman in the sparkly dress, smiling at the jokes, always ready with a gentle laugh. Viewers assumed this was Carol herself, light, effortless, unburdened. But those who knew her beyond the soundstage understood that the glamour was as carefully constructed as the skits themselves. Born in Chicago in 1942, Carol grew up far from the glittering studios of Burbank. She had been a shy child, finding her escape in ice skating, which she pursued with her sister Nina. The discipline of performance, the practice, the posture, the smile would stay with her long after the ice melted. A move to California brought her closer to the epicenter of fame, and she found work as a model, then as a television extra, and finally as a regular guest star on Carson's show. Off camera, her beauty opened doors, but it also created expectations she could not always meet. Carol was warm, but she was no fool. She knew Hollywood adored women like her in fleeting bursts, trading them for the next fresh face before the applause had faded. She took smaller roles in television dramas, posed for magazine covers, and appeared in a scattering of films. But the matinee lady remained her defining image, both a gift and a cage. By the mid-1982nd, the frequency of her television appearances began to wane. The Tonight Show sketches became less common, and her acting roles fewer. She had gone through 3 marriages, each ending with a residue of disappointment and financial strain. Friends noticed the contrast between her on-screen sparkle and the shadows she carried into quieter moments. She was generous to a fault, but her spending often outpaced her income, leaving her juggling debts. Still, there was always that smile, the practiced radiance that could hold a room. At parties, she was luminous. In the mornings after, she could be subdued, staring into her coffee as if trying to read the surface for answers. Yet she remained hopeful, still chasing work, still believing that the next role or the next season might turn the tide. The industry had given her an image flawless, untouched by life's corrosion, and she had worn it faithfully. But in the final months of her life, that image had begun to fray. There were whispers that she was restless, that she spoke more often of wanting to get away. When the invitation came for a trip to Mexico in January 1985, she accepted. A break from Los Angeles, from the calls that went unanswered, from the unspoken pressure of what came next. Under the Burbank lights, the matinee lady had seemed eternal, like a character who would always return after the commercial break. But television had cut away, and this new scene would not be scripted. Somewhere in the studio archives, reels of film still hold her in that perfect pose, the sequence catching the light, the audience roaring. In Manzanillo, the sun would catch her in a different way on the edge of the Pacific. No laughter, no curtain call. The parties were always brighter at night. In Los Angeles, dusk would fall like a silk curtain, and the city would shimmer to life, headlights streaming down Sunset Boulevard, the warm glow of rooftop bars. Champagne poured into glasses so thin they seemed to hum in your hand. Carol Wayne was a natural part of this world. She could step into a crowded room and, without effort, become its quiet center. She was tall, her blonde hair falling in layers that caught the light just so. Men angled themselves to be near her. Women noted the effortless way she seemed to glide through conversation. But Carol's radiance was not constant, it was curated, like the light in a photograph. Those who stayed after the party ended would sometimes find her quieter, her gaze slipping to a point far beyond the room, as if she were watching another life play out just past the wall. In the 1972nd, Hollywood was an ecosystem of excess, where deals were made over martinis, where the right dinner companion could secure the next role, where beauty could be traded like currency. Carol moved within it gracefully, but she never seemed entirely of it. She had a Midwestern kindness that made her seem approachable, and a self-deprecating humor that charmed casting directors. But charm did not pay the bills, and the work was becoming sporadic. Her circle of acquaintances was large, but her circle of trust was small. Friends recall afternoons at her modest home, where she would brew coffee strong enough to startle and tell stories from the set of The Tonight Show. She laughed easily, yet the edges of her stories hinted at disappointments she rarely spoke aloud. Her marriages had each ended in the quiet collapse of irreconcilable needs. The roles she hoped for never quite came, and the ones she accepted often felt beneath her. Financial troubles began to follow her like a persistent shadow. Creditors called. Offers to appear at smaller events, game shows, regional commercials were politely declined at first, then accepted. She was not broke, but she was far from secure, and in Hollywood, security could vanish in the space between two pilot seasons. By the early 1982nd, the balance between her public image and private reality was growing harder to maintain. On television, she was still the sparkling, matinee lady. Off camera, there were signs of strain, moments when her laughter was delayed, when her eyes carried the faint haze of distraction. Friends noticed she smoked more, sometimes lingering alone on balconies at gatherings, her drink untouched, staring into the city's glow. Carol had always been careful with her vulnerabilities, but those who knew her best sensed a shift, a kind of urgency in her conversations, as if time itself had become a more pressing presence. She spoke of wanting change, a move perhaps, or a new direction for her career. She mentioned travel, though never with specifics. And then, one evening in late 1984, she mentioned Mexico. It wasn't framed as an escape, more like a holiday, a reset. She'd been invited by a man she'd been seeing, someone her friends didn't know well, someone whose name was spoken rarely and without elaboration. She didn't offer details about him, and they didn't press. Carol was private in matters of the heart. Still, there was a lightness in her tone when she spoke of the trip. Sun, ocean, and space to think. But when she smiled that night, one of her friends later recalled, there was something in it they couldn't quite place. Not sadness, not fear, something quieter, like a person already halfway out the door. In Hollywood, the mornings after the parties were never as bright. Carol would rise late, draw her curtains just enough to let in the filtered light, and sip her coffee in silence. The phone might ring. She might answer it. Outside, the city would move on without her. Inside, she seemed to be listening for something only she could hear, a call from somewhere far away, pulling her toward the tide. The invitation came just after New Year's, a flight to Mexico, a week in Manzanillo, a place where the sun poured down like molten gold and the Pacific rolled in with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. For most visitors, it was the kind of destination that promised escape. For Carol Wayne, it was something else. A pause button, perhaps. A week's reprieve from the quiet pressures that had been stacking around her in Los Angeles. She arrived with a man whose name rarely appeared in later accounts, Edward Durston. To some, he was just another companion in a long line of acquaintances drawn to Carol's beauty and warmth. To others, his presence was a detail that would later bristle in the retelling, like a loose thread in a tapestry that should have lain smooth. The Las Hadas resort where they checked in was the kind of place designed to be photographed. Whitewashed walls curved like seashells, open terraces framed by bougainvillea, and an infinity of blue, the pools mirroring the sky, the sea stretching toward the horizon. Carol moved through it in wide-brimmed hats and light dresses, her skin warming in the sun, her laughter carrying across the tile courtyards. But if she came to unwind, there were hints that relaxation was incomplete. Staff remembered her as pleasant, polite, but not entirely at ease. She spent long afternoons on the beach, alone at times, watching the water with the same quiet gaze her friends had seen in Los Angeles. Durston came and went, sometimes alongside her, sometimes on his own. Manzanillo, in January, was warm but not stifling. The air smelled faintly of salt and hibiscus. In the evenings, the resort restaurants filled with clinking glasses, the murmur of conversation in Spanish and English, the occasional burst of laughter from a table where the wine was flowing freely. Carol and Durston were seen together in these spaces, sharing meals, leaning in for private conversation, but also sitting in silence, as if each had retreated to an inner room the other couldn't enter. On one such night, a few days into the trip, they were spotted dining at a waterfront restaurant not far from the resort. The scene, as remembered by a couple at the next table, began like any other vacation evening. Candlelight reflected in glasses of white wine, the soft slap of water against the dock pilings, a breeze carrying the scent of grilled fish from the kitchen. Carol's dress was pale, her hair drawn back loosely, a silver chain catching the light at her throat. The couple watched them with idle curiosity, an attractive woman, a man in casual linen. But as the meal went on, the easy gestures seemed to harden. Words grew sharper, sentences shorter. There was no scene, no raised voices, but something in the body language changed. Carol's smile tightened. Durston's eyes drifted toward the dark water beyond the terrace. The argument, if it could be called, that ended as quietly as it began. Plates were cleared, the bill settled. Carol's wine glass still held a shallow crescent of untouched liquid. She glanced once toward the water, then back at Durston, her expression unreadable. They rose, and the couple at the next table lost sight of them in the slow shuffle of departing diners. Later, witnesses would recall the moment as the first visible fracture in the trip's facade, but in the warm night air of Manzanillo, it might have seemed insignificant, a mood between companions, soon to be smoothed over by morning sun. In the days to come, that evening would take on the sharpness of a hinge, a point where one story closed and another began. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of restaurant lights, the ocean moved in its patient, endless rhythm. It had no interest in arguments or reconciliations. It simply waited, as it always had. The night had a softness to it, the kind of warmth that clung to the skin and blurred the edges of sound. From the open-air corridors of the Las Hadas resort, the sea was little more than a faint, persistent hush, like someone breathing just outside the room. Somewhere in that humid darkness, Carol Wayne walked alone. It was late, though how late depends on who tells the story. Some place the moment near midnight, others in the early hours before dawn. What is agreed upon is this. At some point after leaving the restaurant, Carol and Durston returned to their hotel room. They spoke. They argued. The content of that argument remains unrecorded, drifting between speculation and silence. And then, Carol left. No one remembers the exact clothes she wore, though it is said she had slipped into something light, casual, suited to the climate. She wore sandals white, with thin straps that made a soft, slapping sound against the stone walkway as she descended toward the beach. The Las Hadas resort was quiet at that hour. Lights glowed faintly from within shuttered rooms. A lone bartender stacked chairs in the open-air lounge, his movements deliberate, his eyes down. The sea air carried the faint scent of salt and wet vegetation. Carol moved through it without haste, yet without the aimless meander of a midnight stroll. She had direction, though to where is unknown. No one followed her, or if they did, they never came forward. She passed the last curve of the walkway, and beyond it, the beach opened a shallow crescent of pale sand, the water lapping gently in the dark. It is here that the trail ends. There are no confirmed sightings after this moment. No one saw her enter the water, sit on the sand, or speak to anyone else. The sandals she wore were never recovered. The weather that night was calm. The moon, nearly full, hung low over the Pacific, its reflection trembling on the surface like a coin about to sink. In the palm fronds above the shore, a warm breeze whispered and fell silent again. One theory suggests she walked into the water of her own accord, perhaps to swim, perhaps to cool her skin against the heavy air. But friends would later argue that Carol was wary of the ocean, reluctant even to wade beyond her knees. Another theory holds that she met someone on that beach, someone unknown, someone who could vanish as easily as the tide. In the darkness, the sea is both mirror and mask. It reflects what is near, yet hides what it takes. If Carol spoke to anyone that night, her words dissolved into its endless breath. The white sandals, the humid air, the unseen waterline, these become the last artifacts of her living story. Beyond them lies only speculation, and the measured patience of an ocean that has learned to keep its secrets. Somewhere inland, the hotel clocks turned their hands in silence, ticking away a night that would be remembered only for what it failed to reveal. The sea gives differently than it takes. 3 days after she walked away from the Las Hadas resort, the ocean returned Carol Wayne to the world. It was early morning when a local fisherman, combing the shore near Santiago Bay, noticed something pale in the waterline, a form adrift where the waves folded over themselves in the shallows. He thought at first it was debris, perhaps the stripped trunk of a palm tree or a bundle of nets. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into the unmistakable outline of a woman's body. She lay half in the water, half on the sand, the surf washing over her legs in a slow, endless rhythm. Her hair blonde, heavy with salt water, fanned out around her like the rays of a drowned sun. She was barefoot. A thin summer dress clung to her frame, the fabric darkened by the sea. The fisherman did not touch her. Instead, he stood for a moment, staring, while the ocean continued its quiet work. Then he turned and walked quickly back toward the road to summon help. By the time the local police arrived, the morning light had fully broken over the bay. Seabirds circled high overhead, their cries sharp against the hush of the scene. Officers approached the body with a restrained detachment of men accustomed to coastal recoveries. But something about the woman's presence, her youth, her beauty, gave the moment an uneasy gravity. The initial assessment was sparse. No obvious signs of struggle, no deep wounds, no visible bruising. She was identified through hotel records and the confirmation of the American consulate. Carol Wayne, 42 years old, actress, tourist. The sandals she had worn when last seen were missing. So too were any personal belongings. Her passport, purse, and clothing from earlier in the evening were located in the resort room she had shared with Durston. According to his account, she had left on foot after an argument and did not return. He claimed to have searched briefly before assuming she had gone for a walk and found another place to stay. The official cause of death would be listed as accidental drowning. The ocean is an easy culprit, indifferent, faceless, and impossible to cross-examine. Yet the conditions that night were calm. There were no rip currents reported, no storms, no moonless confusion that might have lured a cautious swimmer too far from shore. Rumors began to seep through the gaps in the official story. Some whispered that she had met someone on the beach. Others suggested that she had been drinking heavily, though toxicology reports, if they existed, were not made public. There were even those who wondered whether she had been placed in the water after her death. Her body surrendered to the tide, not by misstep, but by human hands. The authorities in Manzanillo did not pursue the case as a homicide. There was no suspect, no open investigation. Carol Wayne's body was prepared for return to the United States, her death marked as a closed matter. Yet the image of her lying in the shallows refused to fade. Friends back home struggled to reconcile the bright, laughing, matinee lady with the woman alone on a Mexican beach. In the photographs of her career, she had always been framed by light, studio light, stage light, sunlight. But now, in the memory of those who loved her, that light wavered like the moon on dark water. On the sand where she was found, the waves continued to rise and fall, erasing footprints, smoothing the place where she had lain. In time, there would be no trace of her passing, only the persistent sound of the tide, and the unanswered question of what it had carried in from the night. In stories like these, there is always someone left behind who knows more than they will say. In Carol Wayne's case, that someone was Edward Durston. He was the last known person to see her alive. A man in his 50s, with the easy manners of a seasoned traveler, Durston had a history that on paper looked like a patchwork of small ventures and social connections. To some, he was charming, gregarious, a fixture in certain circles without ever truly belonging to them. To others, he was a man who appeared in unusual places at unusual times. When questioned by the local police, Durston's version of events was simple. The couple had argued in their hotel room after dinner. Carol, upset, had left on foot into the night. He claimed to have searched for her briefly, but when he could not find her, he assumed she had gone to stay elsewhere, perhaps with friends, perhaps alone. By the following day, he said, he had booked a flight and returned to the United States. He did not file a missing person report. He did not notify the American consulate. He did not, as far as anyone could determine, inquire with hotel staff about whether she had returned. It was only after Carol's body was found, 3 days later, that his name re-entered the narrative. By then, he was gone from Mexico. He would later tell reporters that her death had been a tragic accident, that she was a poor swimmer, that she may have underestimated the currents. He spoke briefly, without elaboration, and declined further interviews. For those who had known Carol in Los Angeles, his account felt thin, the kind of story shaped not by memory, but by necessity. They found it strange that he had left so quickly. Stranger still, that he had taken no steps to alert anyone to her disappearance. In conversations between friends, the question formed quietly but persistently. How could he simply go? Durston himself was no stranger to proximity with tragedy. In the 1962nd, he had been linked, however loosely, to another Hollywood death, that of actress Diane Linkletter, daughter of television host Art Linkletter. The circumstances of that case were markedly different, but the coincidence was difficult for some to ignore. In the absence of evidence, suspicion becomes a kind of gravity, drawing loose facts toward itself until they form a shape that feels convincing. Durston's rapid departure, his muted statements, his vague timeline, all of it settled heavily into the unspoken conclusion that something was missing from the official account. The Mexican authorities did not summon him back for questioning. There was no extradition request, no formal inquiry in the United States. Without the machinery of investigation to press the matter forward, the questions became private burdens carried by friends, whispered by acquaintances, speculated upon by strangers. In the quiet spaces of the story, Durston's absence became a kind of presence. People imagined him on the flight home, glancing out the oval window at the endless blue of the Pacific, retracing in his mind the night she walked away. Did he wonder if she was alive somewhere? Did he know otherwise? Or did he, like the ocean, simply keep his silence? Time moved forward, but his name remained tethered to hers, not by affection or memory, but by chronology. He had been there in the final hours. He had watched her go, and whatever happened next happened without witnesses except, perhaps, for him. The tide in Manzanillo kept to its schedule, pulling out and returning, as if nothing in particular had happened at all. But in the empty space between what was known and what was merely said, a darker current stirred. With the official files stamped and shelved in Mexico, the void left by a lack of answers filled itself with theories. They moved like shadows between conversations, never solid enough to grasp, but always present, stretching into every corner of Carol Wayne's story. The simplest theory was also the least satisfying: an accident. Perhaps she had wandered to the beach in the dark, slipped into the water, and drowned. But this picture faltered against the details. The sea had been calm that night. Carol, by all accounts, was wary of swimming in open water, and she had not been drinking heavily at dinner. Even if she had waded in, friends insisted she would have stayed within a safe, shallow reach. The second theory was suicide, a quiet decision carried out under the cover of the tropical night. This idea, too, felt brittle when held up to the light. Those closest to her acknowledged she had endured stress, financial trouble, fading career opportunities, failed marriages, but none recalled a note of finality in her words before the trip. She had made plans beyond Mexico. She had spoken of possibilities, and she had booked a return flight. The third theory, unspoken in polite company, but whispered after enough drinks, was foul play. This version twisted itself into many shapes. Some pointed to Durston, the man who returned home without reporting her missing. Others suggested she may have met someone else on the beach, a stranger whose presence in the narrative was erased by time and distance. Rumors stretched further still, reaching into Hollywood's seamier alleys. Carol had been connected, however distantly, to powerful men. Some wondered if debts had been called in, if past entanglements had returned with dangerous intentions. But speculation is a mirror. It shows the face of the one looking in, not necessarily the truth. There were physical details that gnawed at the edges of every theory. Why were her sandals missing? Why had her body been found dressed, rather than in a swimsuit if she had gone into the water willingly? And why had no one heard her? On a quiet beach, in a night without wind. Friends back in Los Angeles tried to fit the pieces together, but the shapes refused to match. In the weeks following her death, small memorial gatherings were held in apartments and private homes. Photographs were passed around Carol in her sequined gowns. Carol laughing on a studio set. Carol in candid moments, her hair loose and windblown. In every image, she was vivid, alive. One friend, an actress who had worked with her in the early days, later recalled sitting alone after one of these gatherings, staring at a photograph from The Tonight Show. In it, Carol was caught mid-laugh, eyes bright, the studio lights gleaming off her dress. The friend found herself imagining the sound of that laugh against the sound of the ocean, the two rhythms overlapping, until she could no longer separate them. If the ocean had carried away the truth, it had done so cleanly. There was no trail to follow, no witness to summon. The last confirmed facts were fixed in place. Carol Wayne left a hotel room after midnight and was found in the shallows 3 days later. Between those 2 points, the record was blank. In such emptiness, every possibility feels plausible. And so, the story lived on not in courtrooms or case files, but in the unsettled quiet it left behind. The waves at Santiago Bay rolled on, day after day, pulling in and retreating, as if rehearsing the same small gesture for an audience that had long since left. If they remembered the night Carol Wayne vanished into their dark, they gave no sign. Years after the tide took her, Carol Wayne's name would surface unexpectedly in conversations, in magazine sidebars, in the wistful recollections of those who had once shared the stage with her. Time had dulled none of the strangeness, only made the contradictions sharper. Her friends spoke in 2 distinct registers. The first was fond remembrance, the sparkle of her entrances on The Tonight Show, the gentle wit that made her more than just the foil in Carson's jokes. The second was a muted frustration, the lingering sense that someone, somewhere, had let her down, that her story had been allowed to fade without anyone insisting on answers. Some of them tried to reconstruct her final months. They charted the dwindling television roles, the part-time modeling work, the uneven finances. They remembered the generosity that often outpaced her means, the gifts for friends, the dinners she insisted on paying for, even when she shouldn't. Beneath the glamour, they saw a woman balancing on a narrowing ledge, but still moving forward, still laughing when the camera found her. The entertainment industry remembered her differently. To casting agents and producers, she was a figure frozen in a role. The matinee lady in sequins, smiling under the hot lights. For them, she had no middle age, no shadows. Her death was a small note in trade papers, a loss framed politely, without delving into its unanswered questions. In private, some friends shared details that hinted at deeper unease. Carol had mentioned creditors. She had spoken about certain people she wanted to avoid in Los Angeles, though she never named them. She had also confided that she felt stuck in a way she couldn't quite define. A trip to Mexico, they thought, might shake her loose from whatever held her, but the trip had ended in silence. Durston's swift departure remained a point of quiet outrage. How easily he had left, how neatly he had stepped away from the mess. None of them could explain why he hadn't gone to the police immediately, why he hadn't demanded a search. In their minds, his absence was an act in itself, a choice that told its own story. As the years passed, the mystery of her death was preserved not by police files or press coverage, but by memory. Each person who had known her, carried a slightly different version, colored by their last conversation, their understanding of her temperament, their own private suspicions. Sometimes, late at night, one of those friends might picture her last walk down the resort's curved path. They would imagine the feel of the humid air, the press of the sandals against her heels, the way the sound of the ocean grew louder as she neared the beach. They would see her silhouette against the silvered water, and then nothing. The mind searches for endings. It wants to know whether she turned toward the waves on purpose, whether she met someone there, whether she called out and was unheard. Without an answer, the mind returns to the beginning, starting the loop again. There is a photograph of her taken in the early 1982nd at some charity event in Los Angeles. She is seated at a table, leaning slightly toward the camera, a glass of champagne at her fingertips. Her eyes are alive, her smile unforced. In the background, the lights blur into a soft haze. Looking at it now, it is impossible not to think of the lights of Manzanillo, faint on the horizon, as she walked alone into the night. The tide that received her was the same tide that receives everyone, impartial, without memory. But for those left behind, memory is all that remains, and memory is never impartial. The bay at Manzanillo has no monument to her, no plaque on the sand, no marker in the shallows where she was found. The sea there is just sea salt and light, shifting colors, a surface that never stops moving. Tourists walk its edge without knowing they are stepping through the last chapter of a life once lived under bright studio lamps. If you stand at the curve of Santiago Bay in the early morning, before the sun burns away the haze, you might notice how the water holds a kind of muted silver. The sound of it is gentle, almost conspiratorial, as though it could lean close and whisper what it saw. But it does not speak. It has carried too many secrets to give up even one. Back in Los Angeles, her absence was first a shock, then a silence. The industry absorbed the news without ceremony. Columns in entertainment magazines recounted her career in clipped, formulaic lines, her run on The Tonight Show, her appearances on game shows, the occasional film credit. The details of her death were summarized in a sentence, placed after a comma, as though it were an afterthought. For her family and friends, it was anything but. They gathered in small rooms, told the stories they had told before, and circled back always to the question that had no shape. Theories were laid out and picked apart. Facts became porous under the weight of retelling. Even in disagreement, they shared the same ache, the certainty that the truth was somewhere just beyond reach. Over the years, her name would appear in lists, Unsolved Mysteries of Hollywood, Stars Gone Too Soon, her photograph, placed among others who had met similar fates. In each list, the caption was the same: drowned in Mexico, age 42. It read like a line from a script stripped of its plot, the scaffolding without the building. But the details linger if you know them. The white sandals never found, the dress clinging with salt, the companion who left without looking back, the calm night that gave no reason for fear. Fame, for all its wattage, cannot light every corner. For some, it only sharpens the shadows. Carol Wayne's life was measured in those two spaces, the brilliance of the studio and the unlit edges just beyond its reach. In the end, it was in those shadows that she disappeared. Decades later, her image still circulates. The sequined gowns, the laughing eyes, the stage presence that seemed effortless. But for those who remember her beyond the screen, there is another image. Quieter and less certain, the pale line of the tide meeting the sand, and the possibility, forever unproven, that someone else was there when the waves came in. The ocean keeps no ledgers. It records in erasure, each tide smoothing the sand until the story is gone. And yet, in the minds of those who knew her, the scene plays on. A warm night, the rhythm of footsteps on stone, the pull of salt air, and the slow breathing of the Pacific, waiting. Some mysteries dissolve in time, their edges worn away, until only the outline remains. Others, like this one, remain intact because they are not only about what happened, but about the way we are left to live with not knowing. In Manzanillo, the tide still rises and falls. In Los Angeles, her photograph still catches the light. Between them lies the distance where her final truth was lost.